All right, this week we've got Mike Klepper on with us via remote. And hey, Mike, you were looking at something to do with cryptocurrency. I know cryptocurrency has been really gaining a lot of traction in terms of usage, and it sounds like there's some interesting new malware using a kind of interesting technique to steal money out of crypto wallets.
The piece of malware that we're talking about here is called CryptoShuffler, and it came out in 2016 was when it was first noticed, and it sort of went out of vogue for a little bit, and has recently, in the last couple of months, kind of come back onto the scene. And this is really interesting Trojan because unlike other pieces of malware, that have made headlines recently that are very loud and out there, right? Ransomware, other types of software packages that are very obvious, TrickBot, Emotet, those types of things. This is very stealthy. It is specifically trying to stay hidden on the machine, and it's not creating any kind of the endpoint havoc that you would associate with malware.
It has very minimal actually footprint on the system. There is no sort of crypto mining error, CPU overload, some sort of any visible indications something is going wrong with the system.
And the reason that it wants to stay hidden is because it's monitoring the clipboard process, so that when people go to make a purchase using their cryptocurrency wallet of whatever flavor, this process watches the clipboard for when people copy and paste a wallet address to the clipboard. So if you were copying the wallet address from a website to paste into your payment app or what have you to make that transaction, it looks for that formatted string to appear in the clipboard and then just overwrites it with a wallet that belongs to the malicious actor. So your transaction goes through, it completes, it just routes the cryptocurrency to the malicious actor rather than the intended party.
To me, the interesting thing about this piece of malware is its simplicity and how successful it was. So that's pretty ingenious, and there's a lot of interesting aspects to that, in my opinion, because unlike a lot of traditional malware, like you said, it's pretty stealthy. It's not doing much of anything except monitor clipboard, so I don't even know if it has any kind of network command and control that you would see. I didn't see anything about that.
No, neither did I. It really flies under the radar. You're not seeing a lot of those outbound connections. It's not trying to mine cryptocurrency or, populate, ads or something like that to generate revenue. It's really just lying in wait. And strangely, this has been an incredibly successful approach. This Trojan has managed to collect, based on the various wallet IDs that it's using, between $140,000 and $150,000 over the past, several months, which is over twice what the, kind of more successful cryptocurrency miner campaigns, which do have, those more obvious signs, right? High CPU load, things like that, were able to make in an equivalent time period. And there are some really interesting scenarios here. If you think of a ransomware attack, for example, if you were infected with ransomware, your organization's infected with ransomware, you might have a fairly sizable ransom presented to the enterprise to unencrypt those endpoints. And if the organization at hand elected to try and pay the ransom, were they infected also with CryptoShuffler, the payment would go through but be redirected to yet another malicious actor, leaving them lacking the cryptocurrency and still encrypted. So this is a really interesting kind of attack vector because it's about as simple as you can get. I mean, it's really simple. It's not terribly complex at all, but the impact that it could have, especially in like a ransomware situation, I think is pretty damaging.
Yeah, that's an interesting aspect that I hadn't considered. The other things I was thinking about, like I've used Bitcoin for transactions and whatnot, and you would have to be hard pressed to really stare and notice that the wallet address that you just copied and you're trying to paste in again is not the same one, that it's been overwritten. So that's pretty sneaky. But I bet you there's probably a lot of people who use Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies that might get this kind of malware on their machine, and it's for transactions that they may not be of a mindset where I want to let anybody know that I was just ripped off here. You know what I mean? So I bet you there's a lot of underreported theft in terms of this type of transaction where, if it was your bank account or something, people would probably be a lot more likely to report that to the authorities.
Yeah, and this is kind of like part and parcel with the whole idea of cryptocurrency, right? Because generally speaking, if you're doing a transaction, you want that transaction to have integrity. You want to make sure that the people or entities that are engaging in that transaction, have non-repudiation, they can't, kind of back out, and that you have, some integrity controls around that transaction. Cryptocurrencies really aren't meant to be able to, identify back to specific individuals per se. I mean, that's why they are, used as heavily as they are in things like ransomware campaigns. So it does become an interesting sort of, give to get scenario. If you are embracing cryptocurrency, and has a fairly low adoption in, kind of legitimate marketplaces currently, but it's certainly on the rise, right now, that there are some risks associated with that. But if you see cryptocurrencies gain momentum into legitimate enterprise spaces, e-commerce, things like that on a wide scale, how long will it be before, rather than having, a dozen different cryptocurrencies, from a actual business perspective, you kind of funnel that down to ones that will offer enhanced integrity controls and identification metrics to be able to avoid these things a little more thoroughly.
It's really ingenious and
yeah, I mean, I'll give props to whoever came up with it. I'm not happy about it. Obviously, we're not happy when the criminals come up with a clever way to steal money from people. But it is a clever kind of technique they came up with here that is definitely very simple and definitely stays under the radar.
The way I think users can actually protect themselves is, when doing any crypto wallet related transactions, verify the string they're putting it in, any changes happening afterwards.
Try to keep malware off your machine by practicing good, computer security behavior. Have good antivirus on your machine, because hopefully it would be able to detect this malware.
So Ganesh, you're not talking about a new strain of ransomware that was out.
Yes, Mike, actually, this week I'm bringing another ransomware-related story. Last week, one of the researchers from, Proofpoint, actually, they found a new strain of ransomware. There's a new ransomware recently, one of the researchers found about, it's called the GIBON. It delivered through a spamming email, Malspam. It has some sort of attachment, and it has macros. Once the macros enable, it kind of detonates contacts with the ransomware, and you get the ransomware. This is how the process.
It's named GIBON because of some string artifacts in the malware. It uses a user agent string, and it just says GIBON, or normally it would say like Microsoft Windows or Firefox or something like that. There's nothing particularly special about this one other than it's kind of unsophisticated.
Another researcher, he found actually decryption part of how to do the decryption.
Oh, okay. So that's good.
That's good.
Potentially for any victims.
Yeah,
right?
I think the way actually this came up to the light, I believe, is because the decryption key was found. The malware author has forced to, sell it a little bit faster. They said, it has more encryption, like it's the 2048 bits of encryption. Mm-hmm. But in reality, it's not.
This brings up a couple of interesting points, right? So, if you do get, hit with a ransomware attack, as a practice, you might want to save off the archives, so the images of those encrypted disks, so that in the event that an encryption key does become available later, you can go back and retrieve those files, even if you've chosen to rebuild from backup. There might be something there that you in some situations might be a appropriate strategy. And another thing I thought was interesting with this particular piece of malware is that unlike other ransomware campaigns that we've seen over the past year or so, which have implemented multiple keys and have used unique encryption keys on a per file basis, GIBON still seems to be using a single encryption key per attack, which, makes it a little less sophisticated than a lot of the other ransomware campaigns that have been, more popular over the past, 12 to 18 months.
Yeah, I would agree. I'm kind of surprised that, it seems like early on when ransomware kind of emerged, there was a lot of this single key use, but the bad guys started to learn pretty quickly to use unique key pairs for each victim, and those are the ones we don't like. This is the kind that is actually helpful to defenders because, like you said, somebody figured out how to decrypt it, so that's good. Even still, I guess the lessons to take away from this are the ones we always talk about, right? Don't open attachments in emails that are from people you don't recognize, or even if you do and you're a little suspicious, maybe check with the person and make sure they really sent this to you. If you open a Word document or some kind of Office file and it wants you to do some kind of enable scripting, don't do it, because that would be a problem. Usually that's how a lot of this malware gets on your machine. And then have good backups, right? We talk about that a lot. And
most of the times, and even people are backing up, they never verify the backups.
That's
I think
true too,
at some point they have to verify. And taking just backups is as bad as not verifying it. If it's not useful at the time of the need.
Right.
The backup and restore, actually they go in hand, and after the completion of the backups there should be a conscious effort to verify them. For example, take one backup, try to restore one of the files, or maybe a couple of files, couple of photos, to see whether it's working or not.
That's a very good point. And especially in office environments, work environments, it's good to test your backup plan to see, hey, maybe once a year you test, hey, can I restore my machine, from my backup? And if you can't, then that backup solution might not be the best backup strategy. That you might be assuming that's going to work.
Enabling a view to view the extensions of the files. By default on a Windows environment, probably the extensions of the files are hidden. But sometimes, double extensions is a giveaway. Sometimes, even though you were expecting .txt, if it's not a txt file, that kind of gives a clue, it's not what I really meant to see.
Right. I mean, that's a good point. And that's one of the things that's driven me crazy with more recent versions of Windows. It seems like that's default to hide file extensions. It's like the first thing I do when I install Windows is to re-enable that everywhere, because it makes me crazy not seeing the file extension.
Setting that aside, you have conditions where the iconography that is used in the Windows system to represent a file could contribute to that, right? So if something, depending upon what the file extensions are, the icon might map to what looks like a text file. So a user might think it's a text file and innocuous when it's really a script file or something else. So there's some visual cues there beyond just, absent file extensions that can be used as part of a misdirection sort of aspect of any kind of, campaign by a malicious actor.
So we segued a little bit or sidetracked a little bit, but I think these are all really good points about if you do get ransomware or how to help defend yourself against these types of malware, or even malware in general, some tips on things that you should be looking for or trying to avoid doing in order to prevent yourself from getting infected. So I appreciate you bringing that story to us.
For any ransomware, I think the primary and the first thing is to have backups. Good verified backups.
This one's spreading via email phishes, so be very cautious when you get emails that have attachments in them. Don't open attachments, especially if you don't know who it's from. All right, Ganesh, so let's take a look at the internet weather for this week. This is the most probe ports, or where we've had the most scanning, not necessarily that there's that many devices scanning on these ports, but just sheer volume of scanning. So it doesn't necessarily indicate botnet activity, but it's more maybe single actors doing lots of scanning activity. No big surprises here. The two that we're going to take a look at, and we've talked about all these ports before, so I'm not going to go over them in ad nauseum detail, but we're going to take a closer look at 8545 TCP, which we've talked about in the few most recent shows. It's related to Ethereum. And then 53413 UDP has also been creeping up and down over the past few weeks, and it's back in the top 10 again. It climbed back up 6 positions. There's actually a little interesting story with that one that we're going to take a closer look at. The ones I generally kind of find more interesting usually, because they usually indicate botnet related activity, is when you have the most sources probing. So when you have a lot of sources all in unison scanning on particular ports and protocols. So we're going to take well, Telnet is the #1 one. It's been the #1 one for a long time now. Just the sheer volume of scanning on Telnet is been through the roof for the past year and a half, 2 years now probably. 445 TCP is mostly related to WannaCry and some of these other families of malware, that set of exploits like Eternal Blue, Eternal Synergy, Eternal Romance, for compromising Windows machines that aren't patched for that vulnerability. So those are the basic ones. There's a lot of other types of ones we don't really focus in on because they're mostly related to backscatter, like the ICMP stuff. So let's take a look at a couple of the ones in particular that we called out. So Ethereum, we've talked about this over the past few weeks. We know that there's this vulnerability in a particular Ethereum wallet software package that some bad actors discovered a vulnerability for, and they were able to find these listening on port 8545 TCP. People were scanning for them and found that they could hack into these vulnerable parity wallets and then steal the Ethereum cryptocurrency from it. So it's been going up, and it's even higher than it had been in the past. We're at about 110 million scan flows per hour, but there's not a whole lot of sources involved here. To me, this doesn't look like botnet-related activity. It's probably a small number of actors trying to find if there's any of these
looking for this port
vulnerable Ethereum wallets out there still. I don't know if they're successful in that, but $30 million haul was pretty big for a vulnerability in this software wallet that was out there for Ethereum. The next one, and this one I thought was a little interesting. We've been talking about this, and I've kind of just been assuming that it's related to this Netis router vulnerability. So port 53413 UDP, way back in 2014, August timeframe, and this is exactly when this activity started to kick up. There was a vulnerability announced in these Netis routers, which is a Chinese manufactured router that if you send a special packet to this port and protocol on port 53413 UDP, you can give it instructions and it'll execute those instructions, which is kind of crazy. So it's a basically wide open backdoor, just like they explained. And we've seen like various levels of scanning activity that's gone up and down over the last few years here. And there's a really big spike back in, I guess, maybe summertime, late summer of 2016. And it's kind of been, you know, there's kind of this steady state noise floor of scanning activity going on, but in the past month or so, it's kind of crept back up again. So in our Honeypot captures, we do see, you know, that there are Netis router exploit attempts, and this is just a sample one that we captured from our Honeypot. And it usually starts with this. This is kind of the leading indicator that is part of that exploit pattern where they pad these A character, a couple of null bytes AA, and then they issue some instructions that they want it to do. There's about more than 100 sources involved in this scanning activity based on looking at our Honeypot captures, but there's not that many actual scan records for it, or scan packets, so to speak. What I did see is there's 5 times as many that I don't know what they are, and it's just a small number of sources. So I think this recent uptick that we're seeing is really attributed to this activity here. I don't really know what it is yet, but we kind of showed a little sample of it on the show. So maybe as we go along here, we'll figure out why these actors are scanning on that port using this GET request. And what they're doing is they're doing a GET/HTTP 1.1 with a host of www. That's the only thing in the packet. Small little packet, however many bytes that is. And it's UDP. HTTP is over TCP. It's not connected to this that I can see. But when I looked at some of these scan sources coming into our honeypots, this is what they were trying to do. And they're doing it more frequently than they're doing these types of things. And it's different sets of actors doing these two types of scanning. So I don't know what to make of that yet, just an observation that maybe we might find out more in the future here. So let's move forward to the scanning on port 81 TCP.
81 TCP is it's related to recent IoT Reaper botnet. It kind of looks for, I believe, go-ahead web servers.
You had pointed out that IoT Reaper, we've seen a lot of increased scanning related to that. There's a lot of various ports IoT Reaper. It's mostly targeting these web-based consoles and types of things of that nature that they're trying to exploit for various consumer-grade devices. One of them, and actually one of the exploits they're trying to exploit in IoT Reaper, as well as other people, is the go-ahead web server vulnerability that was kind of talked about back in April 2017, which is right when this activity started to really kick off on port 81 TCP. Go-ahead web server kind of for these particular family of security camera DVRs likes to listen on port 81 TCP by default. So that's why I think we're seeing a lot of increased scanning on that. And again, this one is really indicative of botnet activity because the scan sources is high. So we're at about, it's not that many. I'm going to say, what is it, like 5,000 scan sources per hour? That's not a lot compared to some of these other types of botnets we see activity on. But back in its heyday, when it first was announced, we saw upwards of 50,000 or more scan sources per hour trying to look for vulnerable devices to target. And then lastly, one of the other ones I was looking a little closer at was 445 TCP. We've talked about this for the past few months.
Yeah.
WannaCry kind of famously got this kick-started again. We've seen other botnets target this port for certain vulnerabilities way in the past. So Conficker was one of them,
Conficker is
right?
one of the big ones.
And we started to see the decline as all the old Conficker machines went away and they got replaced. We started to see all the scanning activity really go down. But then when WannaCry ransomware came out, which is this little spike here, is when that happened. We've since seen just this really steep upward trend that has not abated in any way.
And it's still growing.
It's still growing from the Conficker days, but now we're back up into 55,000 scan sources per hour. And every week we keep checking it and it keeps going up. So that's not necessarily good. They're probably exploiting things like Eternal Blue, Eternal Synergy, Eternal Romance, all leverage that same port. There's a suite of kind of exploits that was released in the Shadow Brokers dump. So interesting thing. One thing I did want to check a little more closely on it, because I was like, what are all these devices? And I thought this was a little interesting. So what I did is I collected a list of the scan sources for the past few hours just recently. Okay. So it's not a great analysis because just from this morning, I just grabbed the list of the scan source IPs in the past couple of hours. And I saw that in terms of probes by volume, United States, Netherlands are the top big ones. And then some of these other ones just kind of go down. And then there's a whole bunch I grouped anything past the top 20 is in the all others on the right there. Okay. The thing I thought was interesting is I looked at scan source volume by country, and this is the number of source IPs. So which countries have the most number of sources involved in the scanning? And Venezuela came out way on top. I was like, wow, that's kind of interesting. Then Russian Federation, then United States, blah, 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 and we go down through the list. And I thought it was kind of interesting that Netherlands is way up here in terms of volume, in terms of how much scanning they're doing, but they have a very relatively small number of sources compared to some of the other ones we have here, So I thought that was interesting too. I don't know what to account for that.
Yeah, even it's the same thing with the Venezuela. If you actually, in the top chart, it's very minuscule.
Right.
But the trending is actually kind of reversed with respect to...
It's reversed, right. So this is really kind of odd that there's so many. It's probably more than double, 2.5 times the number of sources in the United States. Venezuela has 2.5 times more. So that I was kind of like wondering, why is that? And I've always theorized, well, maybe it's because some of these other countries are emerging economies, I should say. There's a lot more piracy going on. And I did find this. It's an older study, but I thought it was very interesting because I basically just Googled. I said, Venezuela software piracy. And I found out that somebody had done a report or a study, and the top 3 countries with the highest piracy rates are Venezuela at 80%. It was number 1. Indonesia 86%, China 77%. And this is from a Huffington Post article. That's a little dated. I couldn't find a more recent one, unfortunately. I don't know if anybody's still studying it. But I thought it was interesting that they did show up there. Typically when people pirate software, it's not registered. So they may or may not get patches because of that. And usually it's not. They're not going to get the patches because they haven't authenticated their version of Windows, which makes their machines vulnerable to getting infected. And you touch the internet for even like maybe 30 minutes, you're going to get probed and you'll probably get WannaCry installed on your machine because there's just enough of them out there scanning the internet at large. It's interesting. I just find it very interesting that Venezuela is so high.
It's very interesting, to see basically, these 2 charts, like a top and bottom, it gives you, different perspective.
Right. And all this being said, I did only select a small window of time for my study. I didn't select, multiple days of scan sources and whatnot, which would probably be good to do as a follow-up activity. Generally speaking, even taking a few hours just from any period of the day in our data is pretty good representation of what it looks like most of the time. So
it's a kind of interesting. It's still, evolving story. Probably will have more details in near future.